On the KPBS Roundtable today, harassment allegations against Mayor Filner get specific, including descriptions of possible sexual battery. And is he intimidating, in need of help, wrestling a monster within, or merely a hugger by nature? Bob Filner says all these things about himself. Plus, the micromanaging Democrat hands over the city reins to an establishment Republican. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are J.W. August, editor of the investigative team at 10 News, Scott Lewis, CEO of Voice of San Diego, and Sandhya Dirks, Metro reporter for KPBS News. Let's begin here today with sexual harassment allegations against Mayor Filner. They again dominated the news this week. Allies turned accusers. Former Councilwoman Donna Fry and attorneys Marco Gonzalez and Corey Briggs got specific at another press conference. And the terms of Filner headlock and Filner dance entered the political lexicon here in San Diego. Last night, the San Diego Democratic leaders met and decided not to ask the mayor to resign. But, Sandhya, that was very close, and you talked to somebody who was in that meeting. It was a closed meeting. Tell us what you've learned about that.
Well, the vote was 24-24. At first, it was 23-24, but, there was a deciding vote cast, and it was a really contentious meeting. I talked to somebody who said it was incredibly emotional, and he said that there was a real generational divide with the younger members of the Democratic Party, basically saying about Filner, get him out of there. But some of the older stalwarts saying, no due process, we should stick with him.
Okay, so, and again, that was not open to the press, and it's an interest. So they're still on the fence, basically, in no news, and they're going to wait and watch.
The party is really split in half over this, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They released something today that I thought was fascinating. They said there was no consensus on whether to ask him to resign, and I think it's interesting, whether Francine Busby wasn't she that tying vote?
She was.
She's the head of the.
So they were going to ask him to resign, and then she stopped that. She's the head of another organization called Run Women Run, which did ask him to resign. So she's in a really interesting position. Mm-hmm. But I think that they released a statement that said they condemn his alleged behavior. And then they said, but there's no consensus whether to ask him to resign, and we don't know whether for sure he did it, and if he did, then he needs to go. But then they said this: they said the mayor has betrayed the trust of San Diegans. Mm-hmm. So if you're still on the fence about whether he's done something, how did he do that? If there's still a chance that he didn't do anything, how did he do that? And I think a lot of that goes back to that bizarre apology that he issued last week, which I think will become a historic problem for him and for the city.
And I think that's a good point. We're going to parse that closely here in a minute. JW, I wanted to ask you about that press conference this week.
Well, let
Monday.
me go back to this question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I somebody told me yesterday, a longtime political watcher, what was going to happen in this vote ahead of time, because he said it's the same mantra for both parties. He may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, and they decided to stay with him, especially the old timers.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was the younger ones were really up in arms and actually were just saying we need a new strong leader for the Democrats, and this isn't our guy.
Well, let's go to that press conference again. This was the second press conference, and at least one person there, Donna Fry, had a completely different tone from last week. I mean, they tell us what happened here compared with that earlier, more vague press conference.
Well, she was pretty animated and got riled up when she was asked some questions like, "Show me the money."
Where's
kind
the
of
beef?
Question.
Yeah,
show us the beef. Where's the beef? And she was pretty upset about it. It was interesting. It was men reporters questioning her like that, and I thought that was. I think the whole issue is your perception of your men versus women.
So gender matters here.
You got it.
Yeah. Now, she and Marco Gonzalez and Corey Briggs, the two attorneys who appeared with her, of course, they had more specifics this week. And they were asking that question, where's the beef, last week? And we had some specifics about a city employee. We had specifics about a volunteer on the campaign. And tell us about some of the details.
Do you want to start?
No, please. I'm going to go ahead and let you
dive right in. Well, I mean, you had three sort of separate cases. One was somebody who worked directly for the mayor. One was someone who had worked on their campaign, and another one was a constituent. The most sort of really sort of shocking charges that really rise to the level of sexual battery were the ones that were the person who worked on the campaign, because there were charges of forcible touching, groping, kissing in ways that really would account to being far more than a sex scandal, as it's been called, but actually something that is illegal, that is a violation of women's rights.
Right.
The women I've been talking to pretty much matched up the MO that they spoke about, where he would get women alone and then put a move on them and see how far he could push it.
Yeah, and there was a pattern described, and I think Donna Fry specifically talked about this pattern, and that's what you're saying
Right.
there, where you
The-
would
I
kind of
have
judge,
two
are you married, and or are you seeing anyone, and it would follow a
Well,
specific
he'd start like,
pattern.
I'm a lonely guy, I'm looking for friendship, da-da-da-da, and it goes from there. And he doesn't take no for an answer. He's very aggressive. The lady I talked to said that he actually grabbed a part of her anatomy. And I said, that's a crime.
Now, let's go back to that press conference for a moment. The folks who, Donna Fry and Corey Briggs and Marco Gonzalez, may regret not having this in a closed attorney's office, because they're out there on the Civic Center Plaza, and there were some Filner supporters. They were shouting things out, and they had some signs. But what were the signs saying?
Well, all of them said due process for Mayor Filner. And this argument has emerged as his best one since he struggled a little bit in casting his response to this. But basically, look, I deserve due process. I deserve to, these people pushing on this, prosecuting or whatever you want to call it, they need to let me make my case, and I need to be able to confront my accusers. But here's the thing. We're not talking about, nobody's put him in jail. He's still the mayor. He still has all his due process, whether criminal or administrative, going forward. That shouldn't stop, or shouldn't, people can say whatever they want. They can say, I think you should resign just based on what you've said about what you did. I can ask you to resign for all kinds of reasons. And here's the kicker. The mayor can refuse to resign. He can not listen to them, and he can listen to people who say don't resign.
Which is obviously what he's doing right now.
It's all in his court right now. He has the ultimate power. He has something better than due process. He has free will. He can stand there. He can stay in this office as long as he wants, until somebody forces him with a recall.
Well, the other thing about the due process narrative, and it really is a sort of narrative that both supporters are going with and that Filner is going with right now, is that due process is a legal term. It's not a political term. And so, due process is this kind of really odd way to be framing this argument, because resigning from a political post has nothing to do with the legal ins and outs. That's when this case becomes criminal, if it actually goes that far. For right now, it's about, can he run the city? It's about, has he lost the respect of his constituents? It's about, has he crossed a line that doesn't have to be a legal line, but is somehow a moral or an ethical line?
So last night, Fox reported that the mayor is being advised not to meet alone with women. Now, that's an interesting thing, because if meeting with the mayor helps you advance, helps you build rapport, helps you become stronger in your career, and now women are not allowed to do that, that's a significant
is that
problem.
a crippling effect?
And so I think that's what we're talking about here, is like, can he continue to lead under this? Now, when they presented these questions to him after that crazy press conference, he never once said, I did not do it, and I would not do that. He said, I believe I'll be found innocent. I think I'll be vindicated, all these kinds of things. It was a very strange response. And then and then the best one was, Univision asked him, they said, what provoked this? Do you think it was a maniobra, a maneuver of your political rivals? And he said, I brought this on myself, my frailties. There is a monster inside of me. This was very strange, and it was a very surreal almost last 2 weeks.
And we're going to play that clip in just a moment. I want to come back to JW for a second. Your reporter on the investigative news team at 10 News, Mitch Blocker, interviewed an anonymous woman. You had her in silhouette, disguised her voice.
Right.
And tell us what she said. Relate what she said.
Basically, she reaffirmed everything we're hearing from other sources about his MO, what he does, how he does it.
And that goes back to the D.C. days, the Washington days, right?
The truth be told, we've been hearing these rumors for years. And I just talked to a city council woman who was on the city council with them back in the day, and she said even then he had issues with women. And I keep pondering over this issue, trying to think of the psychology of it. How come now it's coming out? Why is it coming out now? Perhaps he stepped up his aggression when he became mayor. Maybe he saw opportunities there.
There's a big step between some rumors out there and then getting things on the record, getting people complaining. Look, the fact is, he was a congressman who ran an office of maybe 8 people, right? Now he's the mayor of one of the largest cities in the country
With an enormous staff.
with a 10,000 person staff and constant media attention, unlike anything he's ever faced. I mean, the reporters in Washington aren't hounding congressmen the way we are here every single day.
He's not one of 435 anymore.
Exactly,
And that's a mistake he made very early on, I think.
I think that part of a lot of the things he's dealt with as mayor have been a result of that, not being accustomed to daily microscope view from the media, and who knows why it's all coming out now, but it's very troubling, and the accusers have clearly been shaken by something they've heard, and they're not Republican attackers. These are people very, very close to his career.
Right.
Okay, let's take a look at the mayor's reaction to the specific but anonymous allegations of abuse. In his initial statement, the mayor said things like, "I have diminished my office. My behavior was inappropriate and wrong. I need help." But then his tune changed dramatically last Friday. He said he doesn't believe he sexually harassed anyone. And then there was in an interview by Univision that we recorded, we mentioned. And we mentioned that a moment ago. And he talked about, as you said, I brought this on through my personal frailties. And he said the biggest monster inside me is right now. So in the mayor's own words, Sandhya, are we swerving down the road with him? And is there a monster riding shotgun?
Well, these are incredible things that he's saying. To say that there's a monster inside of me, I mean, that's sort of like the stuff of existentialist drama, not necessarily the stuff of a mayoral interview. And then I'm a hugger, to kind of blame this all on just sort of.
And I hug men and women.
Exactly. And I mean, he's not being accused of misinterpreted hugs. I mean, this is way beyond that. It almost seems like there wasn't a game plan at first, and all of a sudden this due process narrative has become the narrative that they're going with. But in a lot of ways, his comments really reveal somebody who is struggling with something, but who is also so stubborn and will not give up this position, that he's caught between his sort of stubborn refusal to resign and real issues that he cannot really deny.
He has such a personality that he will not resign unless they just nail him to the wall, and they've got it.
I actually disagree. I think that, they say, well, he hasn't been shamed yet, he's not going to leave. I think that if it got to the point where he was completely isolated, that would change. He's an island right now, and his main source of legitimacy are the hard supporters that he has, and this guy Walt Decker, who's taken over to run the city.
And we're going to get to that in a moment.
This has made it okay for him to continue to be in charge for a lot of people, and I think that that's a major source of why he's been able to stay in there. But if he got completely isolated, look, he's not just stubborn. This is the pinnacle of a long career. This would be
a storied career.
Yeah, and this would be almost a Greek tragedy of a career, really, if it ended in. And his whole life is about being in elected office. His whole perspective is about being in a role like this. And this is the pinnacle, the top. To just have to give it away, I think, was probably moral.
We do. I wanted to play that Univision clip because it is rather remarkable what he says as we're talking about whiplash back and forth. So let's go ahead and play that clip from the interview with Bob Filner.
I brought this on through my own personal frailties. And the biggest monster right now is, inside me, which we will deal with. But obviously, when you're a mayor who's trying to do change, people will take advantage of that. And I think people, will have to account for their own motivations in all this. But I'm confident at the end of the day, after a fair process, I'll be vindicated. And then we're going to move forward on the big vision that I have for San Diego and our future.
So he says that he's apologized to his staff. He's a tough boss. He's demanding. Sometimes that style gets in the way. What does being a tough boss have to do with these specific allegations of groping, kissing, unwanted advances?
Nothing. I mean, the mayor himself said, being a tough boss, being a demanding boss is not the same thing as sexual harassment, and they absolutely aren't the same thing. A tough boss is not somebody who grabs your,
Exactly.
He keeps waffling between saying it's been totally misinterpreted, it's hugging, it's I'm a tough boss and they've misinterpreted, to being like, well, the thing that will crush him is that one statement: I have not fully respected women, and I now
I have intimidated them.
Yeah, I have not fully. What does not fully respecting women mean? I mean, that's a really troubling thing. That was all that some groups needed. And if he had said, I do not fully respect Latinos or people with disabilities, that would probably be explosive enough itself.
Right.
Right.
And I
Okay.
think that that apology last Thursday will live in infamy.
Oh,
Infamy.
absolutely.
And
Well,
the other part,
interesting-
go ahead, JW.
It's interesting what his handlers have done, though. I think that idea of due process was an idea maybe from Shepard or one of the consultants. Let's frame this in a simple way that people can understand and get behind the opposition.
Well, we treasure due process.
And he has a point. I mean, the thing is, we are hearing these press conference allegations. We don't know who's making them. They're being made anonymously. There are rumors and innuendos. There's just a lot of that going around. And so that does make it difficult for us to suss out the truth here. So there is that point. But on the other side, there is this sort of, you know, it doesn't really matter even, and this is the argument that I think some of the lawyers make, it doesn't even matter what's true, because if you admit that you were not fully respecting half of the population, people who are working in your office, I mean, you were talking about how, you know, women have been advised not to go up to him. If that's true, I haven't been able to get an interview with him. Is that because I'm a woman? You know, these questions are
He
out
won't
there.
talk to me either.
Well, that's an interesting point. He gave 3 television interviews, all of whom to men,
to men.
and there were women waiting outside from networks
Right.
like
Yeah.
yours,
Yes.
and that's troubling. There was an NBC reporter who was waiting there, and they offered an interview to one of her colleagues, who
A male
was a
colleague,
man.
yeah.
So it was like, well, I'm here, why not me? And you know, maybe it's not uncommon for politicians to select, you know, the people they want to interview with, but boy, this is just not coming together very well for a response.
And you know, you were talking about the saying not fully respected women. There was another statement in that confession, the one about, if you know, basically I could have gotten away with this 20 years ago,
right,
but
the
I
Mad
can't get
Men's-
away with it now.
yeah.
the Mad
gosh,
Men
yeah.
defense, right? Like we're not in a Mad Men era
all he
anymore.
needs is a glass of scotch and a cigarette when he did that.
That's to me that's incredibly disturbing,
Yeah.
because you know, we're talking about 2013 right now.
Right.
Right.
Well, it was also weird too to say like this would have been okay 20 years ago, as though like that's
A defense.
Yeah.
that's almost a way of denying it. Like
Yeah.
that's almost a way of saying like, look, you know, it's this PC thing we're dealing with now. I'll play the game though. I'm all about the game, but you know, come on, things have changed.
Now, this was a mayor who was remarkably visible. He's out at every junior
Filner
high school,
everywhere, yeah.
ribbon cutting. I mean, some of the events were just kind of
But he's
amazing.
still
he would
doing
show
things.
Right, he is. Now, I wanted to get at that whole flyer that came out yesterday. Describe what we're referring to here.
Well, it's sort of that. It is literally a flyer. It's not really a press release, and there's these pictures of him sort of at these different events, and it kind of the take-home messages. I was reading it, and obviously this is subjective, but the take-home message was, I'm still out there being Filner everywhere, but in these sort of more controlled situations.
All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. The mayor, who's becoming a national figure of fun, is fiercely resisting calls to resign, as we've said. So the question becomes, how much political damage has he suffered, in addition to the loss of longtime political allies like Donna Fry and Tony Atkins, Scott Peters, Lorena Gonzalez, and Councilman David Alvarez? Mayor Filner has lost key members of his staff. He moved to stem that tide this week by making an unexpected appointment to the position of Chief Operating Officer. Scott Lewis, tell us about Walt Eckert and his political cover for Mr. Filner.
I have a tremendous respect, and I think a lot of people do, for Walt. Walt is one of these super competent bureaucrats, these people who really are well known in this circle of municipalities as people who can manage a big bureaucracy
14 years
and
running
do it
the
well.
county.
He's very proud of that, and I think for good reason. And problems with the county, he can say are really problems with the policy direction or discussion of the Board of Supervisors. So now he's been put in charge of the mayors, and they made a big point of saying that he now has control over contract signing, of hiring and firing people, and of giving orders to staff. And so I think that was an attempt to tell the business community in particular, and people who need to get stuff done, that hey, we got this. This guy's in charge. You can rely on that.
Somebody's
and we're
in the
already
wheelhouse
hearing
steering the ship.
Yeah, we're already hearing things getting pushed through a lot faster. Organization going through public records being responded to, and so he's saying probably the biggest thing you're all afraid of is that we can't run the city. Hey, don't worry, I got this guy.
All that said, however, he has become, as I said, a figure of fun. We're going to toss to a clip here from comedian Stephen Colbert.
I have diminished the office to which you elected me. I'm clearly doing something wrong. And I've reached into my heart and soul and realized I must and will change my behavior.
See, this man reaches into hearts and souls. And it's not his fault if sometimes there are titties in the way.
All right, so you can have the Walt Eckards, you can have the assurances that somebody's in charge, somebody's got their hand on the tiller, and yet how much damage does this sort of thing do from here all the way to a national audience?
What, you know,
It's all over the country.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's following the story.
I think that it was Mayor Murphy, the last mayor to resign, was in 2005. He got
Mayor Enron by the Sea.
He got some national media coverage that really a lot of people speculated would just hurt him enough that
Worst mayor in the country.
third
Remember
worst
the-
mayor
or
or whatever,
something like
according
that.
to Time Magazine. And whatever validity that had, or what other things were contributing to that. I don't think he wanted a second term anyway as mayor, but that hurts. And I think a lot of people are looking at this and saying like, oh, the poor image of San Diego, we're being like represented again horribly. I think that there is an effort to hold the mayor accountable by people in his own party, by people as close to him, to a higher standard. And I think that there's something to that we should be proud of, that we're having a big discussion about women in public affairs. We're having a good discussion about what the mayor should and be held to. And if we have to show our dirty laundry or our problems in order to fix things, I think we should be proud that we're willing to do that. This is a tough conversation that the city has to go through.
And
But
I think
it's a lot of jokes at the water cooler, unfortunately, and that does. I mean, can you go forth, being a figure of fun?
it's very interesting to watch the strategy on his side and seeing what they're doing. I think they've done a pivot from the progressive arm of the party. They've written it off and pivoting to the Democratic business side and even the Republicans. His appointment, that sort of thing. That's where he hopes probably to draw some of the behind-the-scenes power from.
Absolutely. The whole entire kind of hiring of Walt Eckerd was definitely a way to build bridges with the business community, which he had absolutely sort of burned down during the first 6 months of office. And then the convention center. He's now for expanding the convention center. So
that
he's
just
really
came out
done.
today.
He's done a huge,
Whatever
change.
you say about that man, he is a politician's politician. He is the best. I've been told that people think he's the best politician in this region.
And can he survive this? Well, sure. I mean, the guy, he's back in campaign mode, and if Bob Filner does anything well, it's campaign and win. So, Sandia?
But I do want to I think it's really important to talk about the fact that like this is getting treated as just another city sex scandal, and I really, really want to emphasize that a consensual affair which causes a sex scandal is
A la
very
Bill Clinton.
a la Bill Clinton, a la Anthony Weiner,
Weiner, the
Spitzer, all of
governor
those
in
things.
Carolina, right.
It's very different than accusations of sexual battery, which is literally just, it's beyond the pale.
I've been trying to make that point for weeks, and even before, in the sense, there was one guy from Politico in D.C. who said, all three big cities in California had to deal with sex scandals. Vera Ragosa, the famous one with the media reporter, Gavin Newsom with his friend's wife. These are consensual encounters. What's being described is not a consensual
It's a crime.
encounter.
It is a crime, and it's a very specific kind of crime that is incredibly dangerous. While you can have an affair, and that might be morally reprehensible, we're talking next level here.
Right.
Now, he had, again, as we said, the mantra is due process, anonymous allegations, press conference. Do we know if the process has started? Have any complaints come forward? Our reporting, we can't find any as of this morning. JW, have you learned anything, Scott?
Nothing. No. I went to the EEOC office yesterday and went there and talked to them and tried to find out if there's anything going on. They can't discuss any of that. It's all personnel issues.
Of course, we haven't seen anything filed in a court of law at this
Right.
point. So the due process, as far as we know, hasn't started. Let's talk about something else starting, which would be a recall campaign. We had a rally yesterday afternoon of Filner supporters down at the Civic Center. And now today there's a dueling recall rally. I think that's a trial balloon to see how, we talked to, KPBS talked to, I think you folks did too, about this fellow heading up this campaign. What do we know about possibilities of a recall? I know it's onerous.
Yeah, it's not easy to do a recall election in San Diego. I think you guys can talk even more to this.
We
the
have
history.
39 days to get how many signatures?
Over 100,000.
Yeah.
So they would have to get 3,300 signatures per day, which would vastly eclipse what they were able to do for that huge Prop B signature gathering operation. Cost more than $1 million. That one. Now there's some discussion, I guess, that there's confusion about the municipal code that maybe you can get fewer than needed signatures and then get an extension. Say like you have a deficient amount, like you need to go back out and get more. I don't know. The fact is it would take $1 million or more just to get the signatures. What's really interesting about a recall is that the vote that would take place after that would be won by whoever got a plurality.
10%?
So
10% of the vote. You
Right.
could be the next mayor.
100 people run and somebody gets,
Right.
like
Some
you said, a
small
plurality.
percentage, yeah.
It would be extraordinary to watch, and it would be very disruptive. And I think that part of what motivates the business community is not just to come in and sink their teeth and get what they want from the mayor, but part of it what is motivating them is, gosh, that would be just incredibly disruptive if they can have a steady hand up there and make sure. The problem is that if you're worried, if you think that there's any truth to these allegations, you have to be worried about leaving him in the most powerful office in the city.
Right. Now, this recall that we're talking about, this fellow who's run it has some experience. He did it in the early 90s with a councilwoman at that time, says he's a Republican, but he really doesn't want the mayor to resign. He wants this to go forward because resigning would be 2 votes. Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
sorry, I thought there was a clip or something.
Oh, okay.
No.
Yeah, we're looking
That's
for
just gonna, yeah. So in the small time we have left here, does he 50-50 chance? Does he skate on this? Does it survive politically in the bottom line?
Well, I think it keeps changing every day. I mean, I know that there have been times where I've been sitting at my desk waiting for the resignation letter to come in, and then there have been times where I'm like, he could really ride this out. So like it's 50-50, but which 50 you're leaning on changes depending on what day of the week it is.
All right, that wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, J.W. August of 10 News, Scott Lewis of Voice of San Diego, and Sandhya Dirks of KPBS. Check out our webpage, The Filner Files, on kpbs.org for a roundup of allegations, a timeline, and what everybody, including comedians, are saying about the scandal. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.